Brian's Hunt by Gary Paulsen. The Hunt. He left the canoe, but he took the dog, his knife, his bow, and his quiver, light moccasins, a plain dark t-shirt, and a lightweight dark green pullover. He took matches in one small aluminum pan. He did not know how long this would take, only that he would not stop until it was done. But he wanted to travel as light as possible. When he waded the shallows and went to the main shoreline, he stopped and used dark mud to streak his face and neck, then slid into the foliage following the bear's tracks. He would lose them later, he knew. They were very old tracks anyway, but in the meantime, they would help him to further understand and know the bear, and he would hold on to them as long as he could. Initially, the bear moved along the shore, working in soft mud, following the canoe with Susan until the wind blew it away from him, and then he turned and went up away from the lake. Here the tracks were muddled into soft pine needles and harder to follow, although the dog seemed to have been paying attention to Brian and moved ahead with her nose down. At first, Brian was dubious. He still did not know dogs that well, but again and again, when he lost the tracks and followed the dog, he would come upon the tracks once more, and after an hour of on again, off again tracking, he began to trust the dog completely. It was like having another sense, not to mention a kind of early warning radar. The smell was old and the bear was long gone. Brian could tell that by the relaxed attitude of the tracking dog. They moved well together, and Brian learned more about the bear. He was lazy. He did not climb hills, but worked around the base of them instead, turning logs, ripping stumps, and using distinctive paw marks. One claw was gone on his left front paw and broken in half on his right. In mud or soft dirt, it was easy to know him. Just before dark, Brian came on a place where he had lain to rest to sleep. In some deep grass, the bear had matted down an area to make a bed. Brian felt the ground, not sure what he was looking for, a touch, a feel of the bear, but there was nothing. The grass was cool and had dew forming on it, and the dog was still not nervous. So Brian moved to the side to make a small fire and heated water and chewed on a piece of jerky he'd found in the cabin. Then he drank, put the fire out, moved back into the brush and settled into rest. He did not think of sleeping, not yet. But halfway through the night, even the mosquitoes weren't enough to stop him, and he trusted in the dog's warning ability and dozed enough for his mind and body to rest. Before light, he was moving again, still following the dog when he couldn't cut open sign. But midday, he decided that following the meandering track of the bear would not be fruitful. He figured he was perhaps 4 or 5 miles from the lake where the attack had happened, and the bear was clearly not moving in any pattern, was just wandering, looking for food. He would stand in an area, and Brian could accomplish more by getting to what high ground the terrain afforded, and the hunt downward, trying to get ahead of him, knowing the bear hated to climb hills, and he left the scent trail and climbed a nearby low ridge. For a moment the dog hesitated, standing on the scent trail, whining softly. Then she seemed to shrug and follow Brian up the ridge, dropping into a position just in front of him, ears perked forward, nostrils flared to take on the most scent. And they worked that way most of the day, hanging to the tops of ridges, moving slowly. Brian would take a few steps, stop, listen, watch the dog's hair, back, and ears, and he had lived so long without a dog, wandering again and again, and they saw a bear. 3 times he saw a bear, 1 small female, 2 even smaller yearling cubs, but they moved away from him and the dog, and they saw him when he moved, and they left tracks, knew the bear, they weren't the bears involved in the attack. He knew the attacking bear's tracks, knew his right paw toed in slightly along with the missing claw and broken other claw like his signature, and no new sign all that day, not until evening. They had moved across the ridge and led up a small hill, and somehow, hunting along the ridges, he had come back to the hill he'd moved across before. He did not know it at first, not until he crossed the top, the dog moving just ahead of him, and he saw a place where he'd stopped to listen and rest. He recognized a scrub oak tree, and he leaned against it because it had twisted, bent fork about 4 feet off the ground. "Well," he whispered, his voice sounding strange to him, "we've come around." He stopped because the dog had changed. She had been smelling the ground, and her back suddenly stood on edge, and she growled. "What?" Brian moved to where the dog stood, looked at the ground, but it was thick with hummus and grass. He could read nothing. He held his breath as the dog did, and listened together, but he had heard nothing, and looked back to the ground and did not see anything until he had gone 3 yards farther along his old track, and there, where the grass had been worn by a white-tailed deer scraping, there was a soft dirt, and smack in the middle of the dirt was a perfect print. Large, huge, missing claw, perfect sign, and very, very fresh. It was the bear. The bear. And it was following him, tracking him, hunting him. Hunting him. And just for that second, that long, long second, Brian went from predator to prey, felt a coldness on his neck, felt as a deer must feel when the wolves pick up its scent, as a rabbit must feel when the fox starts its run, Cold, no breath. Everything stopped. No thinking. Just that long second of something even more than fear, something very old, very primitive. The bear was hunting him. Then it was gone. The coldness, the fear were gone and replaced with something even more pure, more primitive, as he thought of what was coming, and the bear's tracks usually actually meant. He did not have to hunt the bear any longer. It was hunting him. It would come to him, and it would be soon. Soon. Dusk now. He thought dark in an hour. If it takes an hour, I passed here, 3 hours ago? And if he's moving on my trail, how fast? Faster than me, certainly. He could be close, very close. In that split second, he happened to be looking at the dog, saw the dog's head turn to the left, and he dropped and turned in the same instant, heard brush crashing as he fell, brought the bow up and tried to pull the broadhead up, but too late. All too late. The bear was on him, rolling him, cuffing him. The bow were knocked out of his hands, flying around, arrows spewing out of his quiver. The bear, strangely silent, pushing, pounding him as the first rolled in a ball, and knew that wouldn't work. Not now, not with this bear. This bear had come to kill him, and was going to kill him, and there was nothing Brian could do about it. He tried for his knife, but the bear knocked it out of his hands, knocked his arm sideways, grabbed his left arm in his jaws, and flung Brian back and forth the way you would worry a small animal. I'm not going to make this. Brian had time to think. He's going to win again. He's going to kill me. And then he heard the ripping growl of the dog, and it landed on the bear's back, and grabbed the bear, turned to hit the dog, knocked it sideways 20 feet, where it lay stunned, and then the bear turned back to Brian. But there had been that second, 2 seconds, and Brian was laying on the ground well away from his bow, but the arrows had flown out of his quiver, were all around him, and he grabbed a broadhead with his right hand, his left hung useless, and dove, following the arrow into the center of the chest of the bear. He was amazed at how easily it slid in, and he saw only 6 inches of arrow showing, and thought, there, that's it then. But it wasn't. The bear snapped at his chest, at the arrow, broke it off, and Brian tried to get away in that instant, but the bear wasn't done and grabbed him by a leg, pulled him back, and slid over the ground. He came across another arrow and grabbed it and turned and jammed it into the middle of the bear, but it still wasn't enough, and the bear cuffed him, slammed him alongside the head, and went down, and the last thing he saw was an enormous wall of fur coming on him, and he thought, all right, this is how it ends. This is how it all ends. And everything tunneled down to nothing but a point of light, and then that went dark, and there was nothing left. Sounds. Soft, whimpering sounds. For a second, he thought, that's me. Everything was still dark. He was being crushed under some great darkness, and the smell of bear on him, around him, and heard the sound again. It was the dog, licking his face, pulling at his shirt. The bear was on top of him, lying still, dead where he had fallen. The second arrow finally brought death. Brian pushed, pulled at the ground, and the bear had finally got free. It was dark, though not pitch black. In an early light, limping and holding his left arm in, he found wood and got a fire going. With the light, he looked first to the dog. The original stitches had held, unbelievably. But he had a new wound about 4 inches long across the top of her head. There didn't seem to be any other obvious injuries with the dog. Settled Brian, turned to himself. Bites in the arm, on his leg, but not great tearing wounds. His left shoulder seemed to be dislocated, and as he tried to raise his arm, he heard a pop, and it snapped back into place with a burst of pain that put him on his knees and brought splashes of color to his vision. Oh, man! But no other serious damage. He didn't quite believe it, not at first. The bear had seemed to be all over him, hitting and biting, and he thought the wounds would be much, much more serious. He turned to the bear. The dog had walked around the carcass, her hair still up, growling with bared teeth. But when the bear hadn't moved, and was obviously dead, she had moved closer, peed on the bear's leg, back-kicked dirt onto the body, and walked away to sit off to the side, licking her left rear leg where she had a small cut. The bear lay dead, and Brian tried to find some feeling of triumph as the dog had, some sense of victory, but all he could think were that David and Anne and the great loss that Susan and her brother and sister had in their lives now. They had thought there would be more. He even hoped he would feel more, but there was nothing but the loss of his friends and a dead bear. Not a villain, not an evil thing, just a dead bear, like any other dead animal that he might have hunted. Killing the bear did not bring back his friends, did not ease the pain for Susan and her brother and sister. It was just what it was, a dead bear. And he would have to clean it now, skin it, pull the carcass down to the lake, and get his canoe, and take it back to camp and use what he could. not waste any more than he had to, because in the end it was wrong to waste the bear as it was to let it live after what it had done. In the firelight he found his bow and arrows and knife, a small aluminum pot, and the pot was dented, but he pulled the edges apart to make it serviceable. It was not far to the lake, and he brought water up and boiled it and gave some to the dog and drank some himself. Then he boiled mud and put it on his cuts and the dog's head to keep morning flies away. Then he took the knife and turned to the bear. There was much work to do.